4 spooky horror stories of abandoned places. Story 1. This happened when I was growing up in the late 1990s. My family lived in the suburbs, and there was a lot of forest around. On weekends I used to explore some of the trails and streams. He wasn't the most popular kid in school back then. There were a few guys at my high school that I was kind of friends with, but it seemed like I wasn't really a member of their group. One of those guys was Brent. He was bigger than us, and I think he could have been a year above the rest of us. He may have repeated a year, because he wasn't the smartest either. He was at least 6 inches taller than the rest of us, with scruffy brown hair. I was also a little overweight, but strong. On a Friday afternoon in late October, I was about to leave home from school. I was on the sidewalk leading to the parking lot when Brent approached me. He told me that one of the boys found an old abandoned house in the woods, and they were all going to check it that night. He invited me to come. I was pretty excited that they decided to include me, because I was usually left out of things like that. I tried to appear calm and told Brent that I was inside. He told me to meet at 8 p.m. at the corner of Main and Popper Streets in our town, a place near the woods. After dinner, I told my mom I was going out with some friends, but I didn't give her any more details. It was common back then. My parents would really let me go anywhere without much information. I walked down the street feeling excited. I was carrying my backpack that had a flashlight, an extra sweatshirt, and some beers that I had stolen from my dad. I arrived early, but when I arrived at the place, I could see that Brent was already there waiting. "Hey, where are the others?" I asked. "They will be there. Let's go," he said. I was a little confused, but I followed his lead. We went into the woods, and when we did, it got very dark. The sun had almost set, and there was no moon. In addition, the trees were dense enough that the moonlight barely helped. Anyway, I didn't understand why we couldn't wait for the others. They all lived pretty close by, so I didn't know what the rush was. Still, I was happy to be there and was hoping to show them how great it was for having beer. As we walked, I held my flashlight while Brent carried a machete. It was definitely not necessary for those forests, but every once in a while I would cut down some bush with it. As the sun disappeared, the temperature dropped, so I put on my extra sweatshirt. We walked around for about 30 minutes and barely said a word, to be honest. Brent was probably the guy I got along with the least, so it was strange that he decided to invite me. But everyone was supposed to be there, so I thought it didn't really matter. We kept going, but there was no sign of any abandoned houses. The deeper we went into the woods, the more uncomfortable I felt. It wasn't just that we were lost, which we clearly were, but that something about the situation wasn't right. I asked Brent how much farther away we were and suggested that maybe we should go back. He dismissed my concerns by insisting that we were close, but as we continued, it became undeniable that we were wandering aimlessly. Then we enter a clearing in the forest. The trail was barely visible, but our lights were bright. There was a small fire that seemed to have been used recently. There were also a lot of empty beer cans, as well as some trash. Brent stopped walking and turned to me, but he didn't say anything. "Is this all?" I muttered. He did not respond, but maintained eye contact. The blade of his machete was catching the glow of my flashlight, reminding me that I had it. By then, it was pitch black, and our flashlights were the only thing keeping us away from total darkness. I was feeling scared at the time and began to wonder if there really was an abandoned house. After an extremely awkward minute, Brent suddenly turned to me. He lunged at me and knocked me to the ground. Within seconds, he had me trapped and the machete was pressing down on my throat. He dropped his flashlight on the ground and stood next to me. It all happened so fast that I barely knew what hit me. I remember begging him to let me go, but I can't remember the exact words. Just as he was about to hit me, I turned off my flashlight and reached out and turned his off as well. At that moment we couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. He was still on top of me, but the sudden loss of light must have confused him, and I was able to squirm my way out. Brent was breathing heavily, so he knew where he was. The darkness was disorienting, but I didn't dare turn on my light until I knew I could get away from it. Brent lured me there to kill me. I have no doubt about that. I walked in a basically random direction in complete darkness. Brent started yelling at me like an animal. I looked back, but I couldn't see anything. That's when I realized that he shouldn't have found his flashlight after our fight. Otherwise, he would have lit it and come looking for me. I knew I was stuck there with no light. There was no way he could find his way back. I kept walking in the dark. All I was trying to do was get away from Brent. Eventually, his screams became quieter, and I felt safe enough to turn on my flashlight. Surprisingly, it wasn't far from a trail. It wasn't long before I could get my bearings and start walking in the right direction. It took me over an hour, but I finally got to the street. By then, I was pretty shaken. It was then that I noticed that he had urinated on me. Instead of going straight home, I went to a local park and drank the 2 beers that were in my backpack. Then I just sat and waited. By midnight, I finally decided to go home. As I walked along the sidewalk, it began to rain. By the time I got home, it was pouring rain and cold. I was happy to go in. As soon as I walked into my house, I was relieved that my family seemed to be already in bed. I didn't want anyone to see me like that, and I didn't want to talk to anyone. I climbed the stairs silently and collapsed on my bed. I woke up the next morning with a huge headache and maybe a slight hangover from the beers. It seemed like a nightmare, but I knew it was true. He had scratches on his arms to prove it. When I stepped out onto the wet ground, I finally realized that Brent might have been there all night in the cold rain. I knew I didn't have a light, but I thought maybe I could have found my way back anyway. I was too afraid of getting in trouble, so I didn't say anything to anyone. I just waited. By the time Monday came, everyone in our town knew that Brent was missing, and I didn't say a word about what happened between us. He knew he hadn't told anyone either, so he must be trouble-free. It wasn't until the following spring that her body was finally discovered. I wasn't far from that camp where he attacked me. The death was considered an accident, and no one suspected that I had anything to do with it. To be honest, I dealt with some guilt for several years after this happened, but I've since come to terms with it. I was so shocked by what happened that I never really thought to ask for help until it was probably too late anyway. Even after what he did to me, I never wished this for him. Maybe I owe something to Brent's family, so they know what really happened to him, but in a way that might cause even more pain considering what he did. Story 2. I am 25 years old, and even though these events occurred 11 years ago, I still remember them clearly, as if it were yesterday. This is by far the creepiest thing I've ever experienced. When I was 14, my family moved out of the city to a house located in the middle of a sugarcane field. There was a dirt road that led from the main road to the front of our house, and the sides and back were surrounded by reed. My parents called me a fitness maniac because exercise was my thing. I would take my dog, whose name was Jet, for an early morning and late evening run every day. Since we had just moved into this house and it was surrounded by reed, I had to find a new track to continue my routine. Our house had 2 stories, and my bedroom window looked out to the front of our house, so I could see the main road. After moving my things and settling into my room, I noticed looking out the window that there was a dirt road across the main road. I thought it was perfect for running. It was about 5:30 in the afternoon, the usual time I went for a run, so I decided to explore it. The road was long and narrow, barely fitting a car. There were rows of cane on either side that rose far beyond my head. He had been running for about 15 minutes, and when he looked back, he could no longer see the main road. The path was straight but then turned slightly, taking me to another house. I could only see the roof of this house in the distance because the cane was so high. As I got closer, I noticed a little boy in a red t-shirt sitting on the roof. He looked about 5 or 6 years old. I remember thinking, how the hell did he get up there? Do your parents know you're up there? In order for the roof to be visible above the reed, it was obviously a 2-story house. I stopped running and called my dog, who was running a few meters ahead of me. We turned around to go home. I had no interest in going to that house, just in case it was entering private property without permission, or maybe they also had dogs and mine did not get along with other pets. When I got home, my dad was sitting on the couch watching TV. I asked him if he knew the family who lived on the opposite dirt road. He told me that no one lived there. There must be people living there. I just saw a little boy sitting on the roof, I told him. My dad looked at me and frowned as if he didn't believe me. No, Sammy, no one lives there. It used to be a workhouse that farmers used to store their tractors and work equipment. My dad explained. She was so confused, questioning if she had imagined the child sitting up there. My 12-year-old sister came out of the bathroom, drying her hair with a towel. Valentina, come and run with me in the morning. I insisted. Why? She asked. Because I need to see if I'm just imagining something. I said. She agreed to come. The next morning, I took Valentina for a run. We left the dog at home, just in case there were really people living there. What were you imagining? He asked. Yesterday, I went for a run down this road, and at the end there was a house with a little boy sitting on the roof, I explained. So, Dad says no one lives there, and it's bothering me. So, Dad is saying that the child was imaginary, she said sarcastically. When we got close enough for the roof to finally be visible, there was no small child in sight. Let's go to the house then, Valentina said, and I followed her hesitantly. When we got close, it was pretty clear that there couldn't be anyone living there. To try and describe it as best I can, it was a large two-story house covered in black stains, as if it had been burned down once before. It had 3 large square recesses in the front that were clearly usually windows. The stairs to enter were at the back of the house, and behind there was a small dark-colored lake. It definitely looked abandoned, and like it hadn't been used in many years. My dad was right that it was once a storage place for farmers. Around the yard were old tires, tractors, and cars. In all honesty, the whole place was really creepy. It's going to be very strange, but do you have a bad feeling of some kind? I asked my sister. Valentina looked at me for a moment before agreeing. Sammy, is that the little boy? He said, his voice trembling. Before I had a chance to ask, Valentina was pointing to a small room on the ground floor through a broken hole in the window. Through the window, there was a little boy sitting there. We both stared in shock for at least another second before running off into the road. We got home and walked through the door telling Mom and Dad what we had just witnessed. Dad laughed. I told them, girls, no one lives there. I was starting to get frustrated. Dad, seriously, Valentina saw it too. They both just ignored it and didn't give it much thought. Being stupid teenagers and all that, Valentina and I decided to go back to that house that afternoon and take the dog. When we returned, we checked where we had seen the boy in the morning, but he was gone. Jet was freaking out. So we untied the strap on his necklace, and he ran out behind the house and up the stairs. We called, but he wouldn't come back. Great, now we have to go get it, I sighed. We walk around the back and start climbing the stairs slowly. They were old, creaky, and trembled with every step. Valentina got to the top before me because, let's face it, she was scared to death. She had only halfway through before Valentina called. Oh my God, what is it, Sammy? He called. You have to see this. I walked straight through the front door, which was missing, and got chills right away. He wanted to get out of there, but Valentina was still calling Jet, and he hadn't returned yet. We walked through the kitchen to an open room in the house and found Jet sitting there staring at a large cardboard box at least 3 feet high. We looked inside, and it was filled to the brim with videotapes. Everything in me was screaming for us to get out. Valentina looked at me and slowly reached for a tape when we heard quick, heavy footsteps coming from the front of the house, exactly as if someone was running towards us. We both panicked and got out of there. It was late in the afternoon, and it was getting dark. It began to rain as we ran, and as we drove away, we looked back and saw the figure of a large man standing in the window gap staring at us. When we got home, we were sweaty and out of breath, trying to explain to Mom and Dad what we had just witnessed. Videotapes, that's weird. Did you bring any? Asked Dad, now curious. My mom wasn't that interested because she didn't believe in the paranormal, so she chose not to believe us. We explained that when Valentina tried to grab a tape, we heard what sounded like someone running towards us, even though it was already dark outside. My dad suggested we go for a walk around the house and take a look. For some reason, even though Valentina and I were absolutely scared, we still decided to go. We drove slowly down the dirt road. It was dark and gloomy. All we could see was the gravel on the road directly in front of the car, where the headlights were shining. We stopped in front of the house thinking that although it was scary enough during the day, it looked like something out of a horror movie at night. We sat in the car with the headlights directly illuminating the spooky old house and the darkness around it. My dad, Valentina, and I almost fainted. I swear for a second my heart really stopped. It was the sound of a gunshot. It sounded as if no more than a couple of meters had been fired from our car. Dad immediately put the car in reverse and turned it to get out. When it simply stopped, my heart was about to jump out of my chest, and I yelled at him, "Dad, what the hell are you doing?" Valentina was almost crying in the front seat. I looked at them both, and they were doing nothing but looking directly at the front of the car. One thing I noticed on the road was that, as it had rained a little earlier, there were no marks or footprints on the road. They were washed away by the rain, so our tire tracks were the only ones. Then I saw something sitting perfectly upright on our tire tracks, a bullet capsule. It's safe to say that we never went back to that house. It was pretty obvious that we weren't welcome there. I started racing on the track behind our house and had a much better experience. To this day, many questions remain in my head. I wonder what the hell could be in those tapes and why there was a whole box full of them. I wonder who they belonged to and why they were so mysterious. I wonder what was in those tapes and why there was a whole box full of them. I wonder who they belonged to and why they were so important as to be kept in an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. This experience left a lasting impression on me. Even though many years have passed since then, I can still clearly remember every detail of those days. The sense of fear and tension we experienced is still vivid in my memory. Since then, I've learned to trust my intuition and pay attention to danger signs. That day, our instinct told us to get out of that place as quickly as possible, and I'm thankful I heard that. Although we will never know what was on those videotapes or who was behind everything that happened, this experience taught me the importance of being alert and taking care of myself and my loved ones. Story 3. This happened almost 30 years ago, when I was a child, and it's still one of the worst things that ever happened in my city. I was 12 years old, and one of my friends from school disappeared. His name was Gregorio, and he was in my class. Gregor was a nerdy kid, but everyone loved him anyway. It was the 90s, and our school had just added some computers to the library. Gregor was the only one who knew how to use them. I even had to help the teachers and the librarian. Gregor wore thick glasses with the classic ribbon in the middle because they had broken. He said his parents wouldn't buy him new frames until he was a little bigger, so we had to make do with that until then. He wasn't there when he disappeared, but some of the other boys said it was. He and a few other boys were walking back home from school when they spotted a strange man in the bushes. No one thought much about it at the time, and they kept walking. They went out into the alley, but then Gregor had to turn while the other two went straight. That was the last time anyone saw him. It was as if he had disappeared without a trace. The only clue we had was the man in the woods, but we didn't even know for sure if he was involved. The police searched the forest and the surrounding area for a long time, but found nothing. For many months, our neighborhood was quarantined. I don't think I was allowed to get out of reach of an adult for at least 6 months. However, life eventually went on. Fast forward 4 years later, I was 16 years old and in my second year of high school. Our high school was in a different neighborhood that was about a 15-minute drive away. However, I still hung out with the same kids from my elementary school. My best friends were Fermin and Matthias, and on the weekends we used to hang out in Matthias' basement and play video games. Sometimes we would walk around and try to find a party or just hang out in the park. One afternoon, the three of us went out with our bikes for the day. There were some woods near our place, and also some agricultural fields if we went further. We had been there for a few hours, and it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. We were surrounded by rapeseed fields on all sides. There was a new housing development in the distance, but other than that, it was just fields. From time to time we would see an old country house. These were industrial scale farms, but they were usually small family farms. When they sold them to the big companies, the country houses were no longer of any use. So they were still there, falling apart. We had already been through 3 or 4 of them, but after a while we got bored and Fermin suggested that we check one of them. Matthias and I agreed, although we could get into trouble. All of these farms were owned by some company and could be pretty crazy about intrusion. I guess it would look bad if some kids came in and the roof fell on them. There was a large cottage further on the right, so we decided to head there. We realized how old it looked. The siding was all wood paneling, and any traces of paint had long since disappeared. The roof was made of brown tiles, and many of them were missing, and those that remained were rolled up. The windows were all boarded up, and there were warning signs everywhere. But there was no fence to prevent us from getting there. There was a large padlock on the front door, and it looked pretty secure. If we were going to get into that place, we'd have to find another way to do it. We walked to the back. The windows were also covered with plywood, but when we saw the back door, we thought maybe there was no way in. There was another large lock there, and it looked solid. That place was sealed like a dolphin's butt, and it seemed like there was no way in. But then Fermin took a closer look at the back door. The next thing I knew, it opened wide. I was surprised and walked over to my friend, who was holding the lock in his hand. It was cut off. Thinking it was our lucky day, the 3 of us entered the house. The kitchen was in the back of the house, and it felt like we had gone back in time. Everything there was from the 70s or 80s. There was even a cup of coffee on the kitchen table. There was a thick layer of dust covering everything, and we were leaving footprints on the ground as we walked. Matthias and I entered the living room, but Fermin separated and left in the other direction, where I later learned that there was a bedroom. It was dark in the living room, and the only reason we could see was because of the small gap between the window frame and the plywood that covered it. Matthias and I stayed there talking softly among ourselves. It was a spooky place, but none of us were afraid at the time. Suddenly, Fermin called us urgently. We walk in the direction of his voice and find him in one of the bedrooms on the ground floor. "What's wrong?" I asked. Fermin did not answer, but pointed to the ground. There, lying on the floor, were glasses broken in the middle and fixed with a piece of tape. As soon as I saw them, I knew what Fermin was thinking, because I was thinking the same thing. Our minds all went to Gregor. None of us touched anything in that place after seeing that. The 3 of us quietly walked out the back door of the house and left it as we found it, as much as possible. We got on our bikes and headed home, determined to find out if the glasses really belonged to Gregor. As I rode, I realized how strange it was that the lock on the back door was broken. That had to mean that someone had entered at some point. Could it have been Gregor? I told my parents what we found as soon as I got home. They thought I was making things up, but they agreed to call the police anyway. I told them which house it was in, but they wouldn't let me go and help. It was a few days before I knew what had happened. When the police searched the place, in addition to the glasses, they also found a jacket that belonged to Gregorio. That confirmed it. He was there. That was the first clue in the case of his disappearance in years. Despite the fact that the house and the surrounding area were searched for several days, no sign of his body was ever found. I still think about him sometimes, especially when I pass by one of those creepy ones. Story 4. We usually have a lot of hiking, and sometimes I like to just drive somewhere and go for a walk in the woods. Normally I only walk up to a certain point and then come back, but tonight I decided to walk the entire trail. This specific trail goes from a hilltop visitor center. Then down the hill is the trail that takes you next to an old abandoned train track that used to display glowworms, which was now just a pile of rusty scrap metal. I decided to walk that path. It was about 4:30 in the afternoon, and it was starting to get a little dark. I thought I'd explore a bit, and and then get back to my car. About 200 yards from the main station was an old tunnel used by the train. This tunnel had been abandoned for 3 years at the time. There I went to the tunnel with my little flashlight. This tunnel could not be more than 500 meters long. As I walked, over the sound of my wet footsteps hitting the ground, I swear I could hear someone following me and breathing on me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stopped in my tracks and turned around with my flashlight. There was nothing, just a small ball of light from the tunnel opening. I started walking again, and the feeling returned. Then, over my own breath and the pounding of my footsteps, I heard something. I heard a dangerous whisper, "Come out." You don't need to tell me twice, I thought. I felt my big body run through the small tunnel designed for a tiny train, and I heard the footsteps behind me. The light at the mouth of the tunnel was getting bigger and bigger. I felt the assurance of daylight upon me. Then I tripped and fell on my stomach while I was still in the tunnel. When I did, I felt this presence close to me. I tried to get up, but my shoulder was killing me. My legs had decided that they didn't want to function anymore. Eventually I got up, but I was covered in mud all over the front. I finally reached the safety of daylight. Walking along the train track, looking like a gruesome extra from The Walking Dead, I arrived at the small station and managed to sit on one of the benches there. I was trying to stretch my arm so it wouldn't hurt anymore. Then, as I stretched my legs, I looked up to my left, and standing on the platform was a guy dressed in brown overalls and a white shirt, looking dirty and disheveled. I promise you, I'm a big guy, but I've never run this fast in my entire life. Now I'm sitting in my car trying to process what the hell happened, and in case anyone is wondering, yes, I can take pictures of this place, and it's not hard to access, but I'll only go back if I need to.